I should tell my audience, of course, that and they probably already know it if they've been a viewer for quite some time, that I listen to a variety of sources. Not just, I mean, mainstream news sources are one thing. I don't pay too much attention to these anymore because it's always the same line in the West and becomes so repetitive that you're virtually forced to listen to other opinions. And I'm not naive enough to think that, for instance, RT or Russian news channels now being broadcast in Germany or in America don't have their own agenda and are not propaganda outlets. Of course, what we're dealing with here is a gigantic propaganda war at this point, and the only way that you can come to any sensible conclusion of your own is if you've spent some time on your own with the so to speak, from inside the empire, which is the United States, the critique against this by internal dissidents here, and then the situation in Russia, which was very precarious after the end of the Cold War, and you have to be able to listen to all sorts of sources in order to basically somehow come to your own assessment, not necessarily an ultimate conclusion, but at least an assessment to where you can differentiate between blatant propaganda and simply arguments, which really serious arguments, which should be taking place in public. And they are, for the most part, they are not. What RT the RT network has added to the discussion is something that Western powers simply don't want to hear, which is why, of course, they call it a propaganda outlet, which in essence, they are a propaganda outlet. But then propaganda of one sort demands counter propaganda. And given just the slightest amount of interest in world history, you can see that some of these stories simply don't mesh, and then you can make up your own mind. One of the geopolitical analysts who is very interesting in the American and both the British scene right now is a guy named Eric Dreitzer. Dreitzer, Eric? I don't know how the name is pronounced. For the most part, I agree with his assessment. He's only um, heard on alternative networks, on Counterpunch, on sometimes on RT, and his perspective is very valuable, in my opinion. Should be very valuable to Western audiences like myself, and you definitely hear a very, very different perspective, which is extremely valuable to hear because it is not one-sided. He does realize that these conflicts are extremely complicated and complex. I don't always agree with him. I have to distance myself from him a little bit when he believes that, uh, when he equates essentially, like in his latest article on Counterpunch, that all conspiracy theories are the same. They're not. The label conspiracy theorist has been thrown around so often. And as Eric points out, some of it is it is blatant nonsense. It is total nonsense in terms of Illuminati and, Jewish networks controlling the world, when actually gigantic corporations, which are not Jewish based, are controlling the planet at this point, including, Indians, Asians. It has nothing to do with any kind of Jewish conspiracy here. This is basically a power grab by powerful people. And with this, I totally agree with him on this. Now, on the on the 9/11 thing, I'm basically on the fence. I don't believe that some of the revelations that have come about are totally idiotic. They are not, in my opinion, um, the actual objections being raised, the more serious objections, in other words, not the Illuminati and no planes flying and uh, these kinds of things. As far as I can see, the entire 9/11 truth movement was undermined from the very start, but both by probably intelligence services and by relatively stupid people who can't who can't conceive of their own government doing something against their own people to further an agenda which um, is largely bigger than themselves. So I don't agree with Eric on that. I do believe that it has merit that uh, governments can act against their own people, including American governments against their own population. This is not too far-fetched. I'm not going to go into it, very big here, but there is a distinct possibility also, and I don't know why Eric dismisses this, but he well, he basically projects one of the writers over at Counterpunch that this conspiracy is just could never have been pulled off, and there are real conspiracies and fake conspiracies and all of this stuff. But to believe that intelligence agencies operating, without any supervision at all, are unable to pull such a thing off is basically, it's essentially naive. That's the way I would put it. There have been several uh, commentators, particularly in Europe and elsewhere, who have questioned the official version, and rightfully so, because some of it simply is completely contradictory, doesn't make any sense. And whether we want to go into all these, details, this is besides the point now, because what matters here is that 9/11, the event of 9/11, was a pivotal turning point in American domestic policy and foreign policy. This was a clear turning point, and nobody can deny this because the whole terrorism subject all of a sudden became so overblown. Uh, there was mention of blowback, which is very real in terms of true American foreign policy. That is a factor, a real factor to be considered. But on the other hand, I wouldn't underestimate various shadow organizations operating in sort of a clandestine fashion uh, to, and they've probably always been operative. It's not something new. In order to get the American people to accept something as horrendous as torture. And this became a slow kind of thing which creeped in through shows like 24 and so on, into the American psyche, that this was somehow an acceptable way of dealing with an adversary or with your enemy. This was a quite remarkable psychological achievement, when beforehand all of this stuff had to be done clandestinely through intelligence services, uh, being able to support repressive regimes. in any country that they saw fit, which benefited the so-called American empire. It's nothing new that throughout the Middle East, torture is essentially endemic. We outsourced torture to the Middle East when it benefited us. We also outsourced and even trained death squads in Central and South America for decades. This could never be made public because the American people would find something really wrong with this. Unless, of course, they were slowly conditioned into the idea that this was perfectly acceptable when dealing with either imagined or real enemies. This is why 9/11 was a pivotal event, both internally here in the United States and externally. And I'm sure that Eric Draitser would agree with me on this. I also want to, bring up other internet entities such as Paul Craig-Roberts. Now, Paul Craig-Roberts is a very vocal person in alternative media here in the United States. And he is, for the most part, correct in saying that the empire is overreaching. We've basically we're lashing around, instigating mayhem all over the place. But the one thing that bothers me about Paul Craig-Roberts is that he never critiques the policies of Reagan and Thatcher, which he himself was instrumental in implementing here in this country and elsewhere. If he at least would come out and say, look, these neoliberal policies, because this is what they were fundamentally wrong, I would gain more respect for him. But he's not doing this. I'm not sure why not. So, I'm going to continue here in a couple of minutes. I'm just going to read you this article by Friedman, and then I'll probably call it quits. I haven't made videos in a long time, so it'll be interesting to hear what this guy has to say, because it's basically, it lays it all out in the open for everyone to see, yet nobody is paying attention to it. And this is the crux, that hardly anybody is paying attention to it. And that the mass media in America, as well as the alternative media, are essentially ignoring what this guy has to say and the objectives which are being put forth in plain sight when it's not secret, to which nobody pays attention.